Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin the session, I wanted to acknowledge the presence of a delegation from the Center for China Analysis and Strategy. So along with Mr. Ranade, we have Apalhamullah, and Namrata Hasija, and Abhishek Darbe. Right. So we are very honored to have Mr. Ranade amidst us. And before we begin the session, I would like to give a brief introduction to the audience present here. So Mr. Ranade, he's the president of Center for China Analysis and Strategy. And he's the former additional secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat of the Government of India. And he was also a member of the National Security Advisory Board. And amongst many of the publications that he has written so far, I will highlight a few of the major publications. So he is the author of a recently published book on the cadres of Tibet and Xi Jinping in China. And then way back in, I think it was in 2012, you wrote a book called China Unveiled, Insight into the Chinese Strategic Thinking. So as a moderator, I'll keep my intervention to minimal. And you will have about an hour to give your presentation.
1 hour?
Yeah. And then we'll have about half an hour of Q&A session. So Mr. Ranade is going to speak on the recent developments which is occurring in China and in Tibet. Recently concluded the 19th Party Congress and the National People's Congress. So what are the developments inside China and its relevance to Tibet? So Mr. Ranade, I welcome you, and please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And good afternoon to all of you. I hope you had a good lunch, which means that hopefully you won't pay too much attention to what I'm saying. Nevertheless, 1 hour is much more than I'd scheduled, but it gives me enough leeway. So what I'll try and do is I will, if you agree, I'll give a brief description of how I see the situation inside China shaping up and how their foreign policy is changing, or their strategic and foreign policy is changing. And in that, when I'm discussing Xi Jinping and the internal dynamics of China, I will touch on the 19th Congress and the recent National People's Congress that held. Two major events that have, I think, defined how China is going to move in the next few years, in my assessment at least. So essentially, I mean, if I want to put it in brief, I'll say that what we are seeing today in China is a hardening of the Chinese state, a definite hardening of the Chinese state. Internally, in terms of the politics of China, the manner in which the party is being administered or governed, and the PLA, and therefore how it spills over into China's foreign relations with other countries. Because with the hardening, obviously it is going to mean hardening of attitudes in negotiations, so reduced scope for negotiations with other countries and in other spheres. And how has this hardening come about? I think if we go back a little bit, the year 2011-2012, which is just before the 18th Party Congress, is relevant because that is the time we saw Chinese politics starting off in a different manner, almost like an American presidential style campaign, where we had different people competing for positions and for getting elevated into the Politburo or the Politburo Standing Committee. Earlier, if you recall, that was not the case. They had enough senior leaders inside China, veteran leaders among the founders, old long marchers, who used to decide that X will be in the Politburo or Y will be in the Politburo Standing Committee, and no one challenged their decision. But now the situation had changed. None of the old guard were there. So you had younger leaders, not old long marchers, who were in charge. And their voice or their authority was not such that they could not be challenged. And therefore we saw a situation where while the party core was still deciding on who should guide the party, who should lead the country, we had one Politburo member, a princeling, a son of a person called one of the 8 immortals. He was Poipo, and his son was Poshilai, who decided that he should actually make a bid for the Politburo Standing Committee. That was his last chance. So he began creating lobbies within the public security apparatus, within the PLA, within the party, in order to promote himself. He also started what is called a red campaign. So the publicity apparatus began being utilized to promote his version of kind of a populist campaign which harked back to memories of Mao Zedong. And he was very popular in Chungking, which is a directly administered municipality. He was doing very well in economic terms in Chungking. Per capita incomes went up. The investment in Chungking increased, and it was doing very well in economic terms. It was recognized as doing very well also by the party center. But things went out of control, and I won't go into the details. But because of these activities, I think there were a decision to look at him more closely and what he was doing. And his chief of police, who was his right-hand man actually from even earlier, he was tapped. He was asked to try and inquire into what Poshilai's activities are, Wang Lichun. And he, an ethnic Mongol, as it happens, uncovered that Poshilai's wife, who was a very intelligent lady, is a very intelligent lady, a lawyer. She had businesses in London and in Beijing. And she was involved in various business transactions where there was an Englishman who was helping her. He was supposed to be actually laundering her funds and doing other kinds of business for her. And he had been killed. So Wang Lichun found that she had used her bodyguard, who was given to her, if I can say almost in dowry, by her father, to kill this Englishman. And that is how the unraveling started. And the party got a shock when they realized that Poshilai, a member of the Politburo, had actually been able to create a lobby within what the Chinese consider their crown jewels, which is the public security apparatus. Because that is the one that is used to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power and to keep the members in check. And they found a lobby there. The proof of that came later when 3,000 members of the public security apparatus, 3,000 cadres, were sent for re-education immediately after he was removed. But this was one. They also found that he had created a lobby in the People's Liberation Army. And after May 2012, when Poshilai was removed, when the plot was uncovered, he was put under house arrest, they started an investigation into the PLA. So that was the first sign that things were serious, and those investigations continued. There were year-long campaigns in the PLA after that, emphasizing the need for absolute obedience to the party, absolute obedience to the chairman of the Central Military Commission, and telling the officers that their political reliability will be again vetted. So there were these very intense campaigns in the PLA that started. It also signaled the hardening of the state. But anyway, let me not digress a bit. In that backdrop, the party decided that Xi Jinping will be the next party secretary. They also realized that things were getting out of control. The kind of discipline that existed in China earlier was now no longer there. And in my view, that is one of the main considerations, main reasons why, after a 30-year interval, Xi Jinping, at the time of the party congress, was not only designated the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, but he was also given the titles of Chairman of the Central Military Commission and President of China at the same time. That had last happened 30 years ago. So by giving him this authority, by giving him this power, they were actually signaling to everyone that they want a strong man in charge. And Xi Jinping was that strong man. He took over and he began moving very fast indeed, indicating that he had the support of the party core. So he convened a meeting, an enlarged meeting of the Central Military Commission, where he told them, right in the beginning, that political reliability will be the key criteria to determine promotions. Not the old debate about red or expert. Red is what he wanted them to be. That was the first shot. He also said he wants more professional officers to be promoted and brought in. But it was only after the National People's Congress met in its session, the 13th, the third plenum of the party Congress, in October 2013, 1 year later, that he unleashed the second shock to the PLA. He brought the PLA within the purview of the party's anti-corruption body, the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, which is the one that looks into matters concerning corruption in the party. He brought the PLA into it for the first time in the history of the PLA. The results were, I would say, for the PLA, a major shock. They suddenly found that they were being subjected to stringent audits and stringent regulations. And by September last year, which is since 2013, last year would be 2017, just before the 19th Party Congress, 14,000 officers of the PLA had been arrested or dismissed. 14,000, which is almost 50% or slightly over 50% of the officer strength of the People's Liberation Army. In addition, there were over 120 officers of the rank of Major General and above who had been dismissed or arrested. Another 70, we calculated, were retired, either on whatever grounds, but they were sent home. You can imagine the shock that the system received. It was a shock that was calculated to achieve 2 or 3 objectives. One was to get them to accept the reform, restructuring and streamlining of the PLA, which in the first dose meant demobilization of 300,000 personnel. Second was that the supremacy of the party or the PLA would be established. And the third, that Xi Jinping himself would be able to pick his own people and thereby build up a group of loyal cadres, loyal officers, people loyal to him in the PLA to run the PLA. So he achieved these objectives, and I'll start explaining that slightly later. But in the party also, he started immediately after taking over, he started a campaign to rectify the party. And here he said that I want people where the village cadre is or where the county cadre is, I want the people of those places to give us a report on the party cadre. How is he performing? What is he doing? What is he like? Similarly, he wanted their colleagues and their seniors to report on the party cadre, like what you would call in today's parlance a 360-degree kind of assessment of what is going on. And people said that this is something like Mao's days, and we are going back to those days, but that didn't happen. But a rectification of the party started. And he said one thing, he said, I do not mind a reduced number of people joining the party, but I want a purer party. So that is what he started off. He also began tackling the Communist Youth League. And at this party congress, the recent 19th Party Congress, he has virtually dismantled the Communist Youth League. He slashed its budget 1.5 years ago by 50%, and this time he is actually almost finished it. The reason being very simple. He said they were getting disconnected from the people, and secondly, he didn't want a group which owed loyalty somewhere else and not to him within the party apparatus. So he began doing that. Over course of time, as he began settling in, he began asserting himself even more. And he did two things at the same time. One, he began consolidating his power, and by 2016, he had already assembled control or taken control of the key elements of state, which is the PLA, the security apparatus, the National Security Council, the cyber warfare. They were all in his hands, the leading groups. He also took over the economy for the first time again, because normally that is a subject looked after by the Premier. And before or by the time of the 19th Party Congress, he held formal posts, 14 formal positions in the state and the party, which is more than any other Chinese Communist Party leader ever, including Mao Zedong. So he had made himself, shall I say, extremely powerful. He also paid a lot of attention to the PLA. We can discuss that slightly later, but he began taking direct control, and he unleashed, if you recall, I said, he got the PLA to accept reform and restructuring of the PLA. So he dissolved, or shall I say, merged the 7 military regions into 5 theatre commands. There was a lot of resistance from PLA officers to that, because they felt that they would be losing their positions, they would be losing their privileges and perks. But he pushed it through by virtue of having arrested so many people on charges of corruption. He also introduced very stringent regulations in the PLA of how they should live, whether inspecting officers, what kind of privileges and perquisites should be given to them, how they should be entertained, and what kind of rations, etc., would be given to PLA personnel. So there was a serious crackdown, and he took charge. He began upgrading the PLA and giving it technological upgrades, so new weaponry, etc. But meanwhile, he began placing his own people at the top slots in the Central Military Commission and in the military theatres which are there. And we see a very strange, in fact, a very interesting rather, not strange, an interesting, shall I say, placement of officials. In the Central Military Commission, the 2 vice chairmen are both princelings. Princelings meaning children of old VIP cadres of the old generation. Both of them. Xu Chiliang, former PLA Air Force commander, and Chang Yaosha. And in the Defense Ministry, unlike in the past, he put a younger officer, Wei Feng He, who used to be commander of the PLA 2nd Artillery, who spent all his time in that high technology force. He was brought in as defense minister. He is also a princeling, a child of a senior military officer. So he has got his people now in all the key places. In the party apparatus, again, in the Politburo Standing Committee, except for 2, I would say all are his people in the new Politburo Standing Committee. In the new Politburo, out of the 25, remove 2 from the army who are there, who are his people. Remove the 7 who are in the Politburo Standing Committee. The rest are all his guys, except the 2, as I mentioned, who are in the Politburo Standing Committee, whom I will not say are his people. They are, of course, obedient to him because he's the boss. But I don't know how far they are loyal to him. Han Chang is one who has been there for a long time. So that's why I put the question mark. I don't say he's his man. The second is Wang Huning, who has prospered under 3 general secretaries of the party, starting from Jiang Zemin. So he's either a survivor, or he is very intelligent, or he's just too competent. But he has continued. He is also the man who is credited with having drafted the China Dream. So that is the combination. In other words, Xi Jinping is in total charge. The other aspect that people don't look at very closely is the manner in which he has built himself up. He has started projecting himself. As you know, in communist parties, being an ideologue, being a theoretician is very important, party theoretician. He began projecting himself as the party ideologue. And therefore, in June 2014, which is about, I would say, a year after he came in November 2012, June 2014, slightly over a year, the party theoretical journal, Chusher, Searching Truth, they declared him as to be probably the greatest Chinese communist leader in China. And after that, he began building himself up even more. His acolytes, people close to him, began saying or began describing him as the one communist leader who has devised a comprehensive system for governance. Later on, of course, that also became comprehensive system for military warfare, etc. But comprehensive system for governance. His elevation had started. There were two factors here. One was his handling of the propaganda apparatus, very important for the Chinese, and always managed by one of the top leaders, a member of the Politburo Standing Committee, one of the top 7 guys who rules China, always handles the propaganda setup. And this propaganda setup, which had been instructed by Jiang Zemin, that is one predecessor removed of Xi Jinping, to project him in a favorable light, used to give coverage 3,000 times a year. Jiang Zemin used to be projected to the people. He used to be make it to front page news on the People's Daily or on the lead item on the China Central Television or whatever. Hu Jintao, his successor, didn't receive such favorable coverage, but he got it nevertheless 2,000 times a year. That has been calculated. Xi Jinping, soon after coming in, changed the dynamic and has been receiving projections till last year of 5,000 times a year. In other words, whenever you open a communist or a Chinese newspaper or listen to the Chinese news, you have Xi Jinping being mentioned in some form or another. It obviously gets into people's minds and he promotes himself. His acolytes, around the same time, began saying that under Xi Jinping, China has embarked on a new 30-year era, like those of Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong before him. Keep in mind what I'm saying, because it's going to link up when we start talking slightly later about what the implications are. And Xi Jinping around this time began unveiling his grand plans, his grand strategies. The Belt and Road Initiative was one such strategy. But before the Belt and Road Initiative, he had organized what is called a Conference on Peripheral Diplomacy. This conference, to which not many people paid attention, they should have, this conference, for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, identified countries as friend and enemy. That was not done earlier. Friends, some friends we know. They identified Pakistan, they identified Nepal, they identified Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Turkey, Maldives, Burma, Myanmar as their friends. They promised them lots of financial assistance. They promised them benefits flowing from China's diplomatic clout, China's diplomatic influence. And they even promised them, again for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, security alliances. So the carrot dangled before the friends was very fat and juicy. That was the beginning of Xi Jinping's grand strategy. How to expand China's power, diplomatic, economic and military power, well beyond its frontiers to encompass large portion of the globe. The second thing that he did was he unveiled the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, what we call or One Belt, One Road. This is again been projected as an economic initiative. But is it really? What exactly does it mean and how does it benefit China? If you look at it for a minute, basically what he's saying is that he will link production centers in China with natural resource centers and markets around the world over a China-built communications pathway or a China-built communications artery. So it means that the Chinese will approach countries where they feel it's necessary and ask them, whether they do not require certain kinds of infrastructure development. Now, every country needs infrastructure. Naturally, the answer is usually going to be yes, we need it, but we don't have the money for all this kind of thing. And that is where the Chinese say that we will lend you the money. Lend, not grant. China has trillions of dollars lying in its banks, which today are earning no funds. So by loaning that money, they are generating revenues for themselves. By getting the contract for the infrastructure project, the state-owned enterprises, which have a lot of technological expertise, particularly in infrastructure construction, and which are today without work, will be put to work. So they'll go out and start building. And surplus Chinese manpower will be deployed. It's a win-win, as the Chinese say, it's a win-win for the Chinese. Countries that have gone in for the Belt and Road Initiative till now are beginning to become debtors to China. And the Chinese policy, so far from what we see, in at least in Sri Lanka and what is developing in Pakistan, is going to be, if you can't pay my debt, then let's have a debt for equity swap. Give me this chunk of real estate for so many years and I'll ignore your debt. That's what happened with Hambantota. It's with the Chinese now for 99 years because they couldn't pay back. I'm waiting to see what happens with Colombo City. The Colombo City development project which is on, Sri Lankans say they've renegotiated it. They've got a better deal. Let's wait and see. But that's in the heart of Sri Lanka. Similar thing is happening in Pakistan, where Gwadar, in any case, the residents of Gwadar have been moved out. No Pakistanis allowed in, and the Chinese are controlling it. They already have sovereign rights to Gwadar port for 50 years before they started working on it. Their naval strategists describe Gwadar as a logistics base and Karachi as a naval base. So their plans are very clear, what they're going to do. And therefore, Xi Jinping's plans are very clear. If you link all these three things that I've said, along with what his loyalists are saying, that China has now embarked on a new 30-year era under Xi Jinping, that means two or three things, at least to me. One, Xi Jinping has all the intentions of staying on for a long, long time. Second, his plans are huge. When he talks of China Dream, that takes on a particular significance in this backdrop. What is the China Dream? He articulated it at the 18th Party Congress. It was approved to repeat it at the 19th Party Congress. The China Dream has three parts. Make the Chinese people wealthy, make the Chinese nation strong, and the third part is where the problem starts, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. And that means recovery of territories that were lost through the imposition of unequal treaties by imperialist powers. For India, directly, it means that we need to look at, with great concern, Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh. And just incidentally, Andamans are also shown on Chinese maps, which are still taught in Chinese schools as part of China. So we have a lot of worries about this plan of rejuvenation. Will he really go through with it? I'll come to that later, but my short answer is, I think so. He's going to certainly try. And we are already seeing that in process, in what is happening. Meanwhile, if we cycle back to the build-up of power and the elimination of opposition by Xi Jinping, we see that happening at the time of the 19th Party Congress, which was held last October. Before the Congress, there were 2,930 delegates who were elected, whatever word you want to use, for the Congress. And for the first time, we saw the party center intervening and disqualifying the candidature of, I think, 70 deputies on grounds that they didn't meet the requirements. 50 were eliminated on the grounds that they were still linked with Po Xilai and Sun Changkai. Sun Changkai being the successor to Po Xilai as the party secretary of Chongqing province. At one time, mind you, till September 2017, Sun Sang-kai was considered to be a rising star, a sure shot candidate for the Politburo, if not the Politburo Standing Committee. And in September, the axe fell, he was dismissed as party secretary of Chongqing. Not only dismissed, he was accused of gross violations of party rules, and he is under investigation, which means he's lost all his posts, he'll probably be arrested or whatever. So he's out. It was a clear demonstration of the authority that Xi Jinping exercises, and he chose to display it. Both these cases. The signal was clear that I will decide who will come in. And that is what happened. At the party congress also, there was a lot of speculation as to who would make it, who would not make it. But when you look closely at the 25 members of the Politburo, as I told you, they are all his people. He has been able to successfully get them in. And his closest people, he appointed as head of propaganda, head of the CPPCC, which looks after minority affairs, Tibetan affairs, non-communist parties. And the senior executive vice chairman of the CPPCC, which also looks after the United Front, is Chang Ching-li, person I think whom you all well know, one-time party secretary of Tibet, and who delivered very tough messages at that point in time. He is the senior executive vice chairman of the CPPCC. So, Xi Jinping Secretariat also comprises people with a background of the PLA or security. So it's a strong apparatus. It's an apparatus that is going to be very hard on implementation of party discipline and party regulations. That's what he did. But more importantly, Xi Jinping consolidated his own authority. And at the party congress, there was a lot of speculation before, but the party congress confirmed it. They included Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era in the party constitution. Party constitution was amended, this was brought in. The amendment happened after 14 years. This was included, placing Xi Jinping on a level with Mao and Deng Xiaoping. They are the only other two Chinese Communist Party leaders who have their name along with their philosophy incorporated in the party constitution. So it immediately placed him on a higher level compared to anyone else. Xi Jinping pushed his advantage, and the first meeting of the Politburo immediately after the 19th Party Congress, within 4 days, in fact, issued a notification referring to him as Ling Shui. Ling Shui being, it was a term as, say, respected leader, which was last used when the references were to Mao Zedong. Since then, it has not been used. So he was called Ling Shui. And lest you think that at the end of it, there is something more. A few weeks ago, the People's Daily, just after the National People's Congress concluded, referred to him as the helmsman. If you remember, Mao Zedong used to be called the Great Helmsman. So he hasn't called himself Great Helmsman, but he called himself Helmsman, number 2 to Mao. So he has established his position in the Chinese hierarchy. I told you, his people are saying that China has embarked on a new 30-year era under Xi Jinping, like those of Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong. I took that statement seriously at that time and I used to write about it. I take it even more seriously now, that he is determined to push his agenda. That is what the party congress has signaled very clearly. The other thing that the party congress signaled, apart from the territorial aspect, which I will not bore you with, about the South China Sea, etc., but what it also brought out was that the party will dominate every sphere of the endeavor of the state. In other words, the party's supremacy will guide everything. Deng Xiaoping, if you remember, had tried to bring about some kind of a separation between the party and the state. He'd also issued an injunction against deification of a leader, personality cult. Xi Jinping has done away with that, as I just told you, the kind of personality profile that he built up. But here, he has brought everything back under the party. The party's leadership was made very clear at the party congress. Apart from the fact that the party was mentioned a large number of times, the largest than in the 3 previous party congresses. Like the army was mentioned more times than in the work reports of the last 2 congresses. Emphasis on these 2 was very evident at the party congress. Then, at the National People's Congress, which was held recently in March, the National People's Congress normally ratifies and consolidates what the party congress had done, the appointments that the party congress was to make. And we had noticed a couple of things at the party congress. We had noticed that Wang Qishan, the man who headed the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, which was in charge of carrying out the anti-corruption campaigns in the army and in the party, he had come back as a delegate. It's very strange, because he was over 68, he should have retired. But he was back. So naturally there was suspicion that he is going to be given some position. And he has been given. He has not been formally brought in to the Politburo Standing Committee or to the Politburo, but he has been made Vice President of China. A post which you will normally say is of little consequence. But he has been given charge of foreign affairs. Not only that, he has been allowed to retain the personal rank of member of the Politburo Standing Committee, which is a variation from the past, showing again that Xi Jinping can get away by making these changes. At the NPC, Xi Jinping did a couple of other things. He, of course, gave the army a lot of budget, but in the process, he also brought about a reorganization of the apparatus of the state. And 84 departments and party setups were merged or rearranged and reduced. And in this we see, again, the party taking control of a whole number of functions that otherwise the state handled. So shall I say, the publicity apparatus, the propaganda apparatus, has now formally come back under the party propaganda department. So radio, press, television, which were kept separate, are back under this. The State Administration for Regional Affairs, which directly concerns the Tibetan affairs, and which was managed by the State Council, has come back to the what they call ethnic affairs. It's come back under the United Front. So party control is very visible. And it's now getting more and more formalized under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping himself, in my view, is a person who believes in the communist state, who believes in the Chinese Communist Party. And I say that because I see him as a man who is, of course, a princeling, whose father held a very, very high position. He was one of Mao's closest advisors. But he was purged on 3 occasions, the last being during the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping saw that, and he suffered along with his father. Naturally, when you are purged, you lose everything. Your post, your perks, your housing, everything. And the 3rd time, he was sent off to the countryside, Shangfa, as they say, purged to the countryside. He saw his father being humiliated. He saw his mother being beaten and humiliated. He saw his sister being killed. Unlike other of his friends and colleagues, also princelings, who either went abroad using their father's influence or joined the state-owned enterprises, he chose to join the Chinese Communist Party. There was no future at that time when he joined. I mean, he was not sure where he's going to be. But he joined the Chinese Communist Party, and now, of course, with luck and everything else, and his father's influence, he came up to where he is today. The point I'm trying to make is not his good fortune in becoming General Secretary, but for a man to have done that indicates a certain mental toughness of mind and a commitment. And I believe that he has that commitment. That's why I'm mentioning it. So, for this kind of a person, what is actually motivating him? He has this ambition of making China great. That ambition, he said, and he and other princelings have said, our forebears wanted us to make China great again. And they're determined to make that. Whether they succeed or not, I don't know, but they seem to be pushing. That is why, when he talks of China Dream, when he talks of Belt and Road Initiative, to my mind, there is a certain special significance in that statement. And that brings me to probably, not my final, but my second final point, which is, at the NPC, for the first time, he also laid out the timetable for China's development. It has not been done before. People have spoken about China Dream, about China catching up, China becoming an advanced nation. He gave a specific timetable. He said, by 2021, we will achieve the China Dream and make China among the nation's more advanced countries, where, of course, with PLA mechanization we complete, etc. 2021 is also the 100th year of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. So symbolically, very important here. Then he said 2035, China will become one of the world's ranking science and technology powers. Scientific and technological development, China will rank among the world's leaders, 2035. And by 2050, China will be one of the world's advanced leading countries, having pioneering global influence. This phrase, I think, is a very significant phrase. Pioneering global influence means it will either rival or surpass the United States of America, because it will have the ability to either set up new international bodies or influence those which are already existing. That's his ambition. It is also, 2049 is the year by which they expect to achieve or realize the Belt and Road Initiative. It is also the 100th year of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So he has chosen two symbolically very important years to bookend his ambition. I don't know whether he will live till that time, because he is 64 years old now. So let's say 30 years takes him to 94. You never know, he might. But his ambition is long term. And by laying out this, he is making it very clear that if not him, his successors will push through this ambition. So as I said, what he has done is, in the process, he has brought about a hardening of the Chinese state. There will be less room for negotiation and flexibility. And internally, he is bringing in very strict security controls. And I'll mention only one, which is the social credit management system. That is a system where, according to the Chinese papers, the aim is that every, as they say, either solid or honest, I forget, every solid resident of China will be able to walk with his head held high under the blue Chinese sky. That is the statement. In other words, they are going to make China safe and secure for them. So what they have said is, anyone residing in China, his juniors, his colleagues, his neighbors, his seniors, his friends, his bankers, they'll all contribute an assessment of that individual, on the basis of which he will be given a score, a number. So let's say the numbers are 1 to 10. You're given number 3 or number 4 or whatever. That number will determine where you stay, what kind of job you will have, whether you can fly, whether you have to go by train or whether you have to go by bus, whether your child can go to school or not, and which school, all that will be determined by that number. And that is being implemented through a system where they're using technology. So you have cameras blanketing all the major cities so far, and they're being linked up with facial recognition. So they lock you on your face, and they get all your details. They are now perfecting that to check your gait, the manner in which you walk. So if they don't get your face, from your walk, they should be able to identify who you are. So next time you're in China, Minister, you have to be very careful. Gauge you. But that is how they're doing it. They're making it a society where every person is going to be under control. So that's the system. Let me come down to whether what that means for us in India and for Tibet as such. For India, we are seeing a situation where I would say the relationship between China and India today is very uneasy. It can go anyway. It's a situation which has been building up. There have been a lot of pinpricks along the way. But I don't have too much time, but let me say that Doklam was really a second watershed in our relationship. The first was the announcement of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in April 2013 when Xi Jinping traveled to Islamabad, 3 weeks before Prime Minister Modi went to Beijing. At that time, when Modi raised various issues, including the border, he was told, and I'm almost quoting here, he was told, you ease your tensions with Pakistan, resolve the Kashmir issue, and then look to improve relations with China. And this phrase was repeated to other groups who went there, on track 1, track 1.5, track 2, whatever you call it, including think tanks, and including with others who were interlocutors with the Chinese. Very clear. That was repeated as late as November last year to a delegation that had gone, and at a very high level. So China's stand is explicit. When Doklam happened, that was the second watershed that took place between us and them. And I think here the point that I would like to make is when the Chinese came to Doklam, I don't think that they had prepared for a showdown with India. Their calculation was that they will make a push to build the road. In the process, unilaterally violating an agreement that they had signed in 2012 between India, Bhutan, and China, where they had said we will maintain the status quo. I don't know why they chose to violate it, but they did. And they certainly did not expect India to block them. I guess their estimation was that at the most, Bhutan will lodge a protest, we will lodge a protest at the most, and leave it at that. They did not expect us to send our troops to block them. But that upset them. It upset their calculations. It also showed for the first time that this aggressive stance that the Chinese had built up, this narrative that the Chinese had built up, that they're unstoppable. In the South China Sea, they felt, they'd already got their way. Other places also, they'll get their way. There was a country which blocked them, and that was India. They didn't expect it. There was a standoff. Militarily, we were at a better position. They couldn't really take us on. Two things were before Xi Jinping. One was the meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping. The second was the party congress. To my mind, it was the party congress that was playing on his mind, because the party congress had already been announced internally in June. This started in July. In June, they had sent out an internal circular that we will be having the party congress in October. Now, once that announcement has been made, either he changes the date or he goes ahead with it. That is the reason for the settlement. If you recall, India was from the beginning saying the only way to resolve this is through diplomatic negotiations. Chinese were making all kinds of threats. Ultimately, it was that, and we disengaged. But the Chinese were very, very upset And here let me mention why I said that it is a watershed. The Chinese made 4 threats to us. Threats that will remain in our memory, I am sure, of our strategic planners and policy formulators. Forget the 1962 threat. For that they got a reply. But they said, we will revive the insurgency in the northeast. Each one of these has a historical background. That insurgency was in fact started by the Chinese, by Mao. And it was only in 1980 that Deng Xiaoping stopped it, because he was focusing on building up China's internal economy. The second, they said, we will launch an international campaign to break this close ties between India and Bhutan. The third, that they will reverse their position on Sikkim and create trouble inside Sikkim. And the fourth, that like we had done in Bhutan, they will deploy their troops in Kashmir, ostensibly at the behest of Pakistan. These are the 4 threats they have made. Obviously, they're not going to go away in a hurry from our mind. That will taint, if not color, the relationship in future between us and them. So this is something that remains hanging. In China itself, let me tell you that in August, 28th of August, I think we had the disengagement agreement. The Chinese were very upset. A Chinese retired colonel who comments quite frequently in the Chinese media and comments in favor of Xi Jinping, he said, we have been talking tough. Why this humiliation from India? What price have we made India pay for us to withdraw? Like that, there were a series of comments. The editor-in-chief of Global Times, He Chishan, he said this is a disgrace and we are unhappy. And a rumor started in China at that time. A rumor where they said that the Chinese had bribed India for the settlement to disengage by offering it a $20 billion aid. It was rubbish, but they did it. The leadership was unnerved, and that was evident from the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Ministry of Defense, and the Chinese Foreign Ministry, each one of them officially issued a denial of that rumor. So that is the picture that we have. As far as Tibet is concerned, what do we see? What is the picture that comes out in a few sentences? I don't anticipate I have not seen any lifting or easing of restrictions inside Tibet, at least from what I've been seeing. In fact, I continue to see references urging people to work against the evil influences that are flowing in from Dharamsala, from the, as they say, the Dalai Lama's outfit, establishment. That is the injunction to the people inside Tibet. There is a serious effort to recruit cadres throughout Tibet. Their target is to have 1 cadre in each village. Each of the 5,430 odd villages in Tibet, they want to have 1 village cadre. Why? Not only for the membership, it is to expand party surveillance inside Tibet. The other thing that they're doing, where they're concentrating attention on, are the monasteries. As you know, they described monks and nuns, Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns, as the real troublemakers. They have focused on them. The effort is to try and win them over so that there is no resistance to Chinese occupation. And they have issued injunctions through particularly the Zhejiang Buddhist Association and others, saying that the movements of Tibetan Buddhist monks, particularly for teaching, must be closely monitored and they must take permission before they go. The new party secretary in Tibet is focusing on 2 things, on the monks and monasteries and on education. He is focusing on, as Xi Jinping says, molding the minds of the young and changing it. He doesn't have to worry about security because his predecessor, Chen Quango, had already built an iron grid and a Skynet. So let me just say that the per capita expenditure on security in China today goes as follows. Tibet is at the top of the list with 400 and some per person. You can imagine. Second, Xinjiang, which is more in the news, more trouble, but that's number 2, at $390 odd per capita. And number 3 is Beijing. I have a very strict moderator. Number 3 is Beijing, which is the capital. So Beijing is very important. It's the heartland. It's where the General Secretary sits. But Tibet, as I said, with that kind of security expenditure, with that kind of deployment, I certainly don't see any easing of or relaxation of controls. Finally, what we are seeing is a securitization of the Tibet Autonomous Region. It started with the letter written by those 2 girls from that Yume village during the time of the last party congress to Xi Jinping, and he replied. They've now started building what they call model defense villages along the Tibet Autonomous Region's borders with India. So I anticipate no relaxation in controls. There is another side to it also, which is after Chen Quango left, the new party secretary, as I said, he doesn't really have to worry that much about security. So he has reduced the number of jobs being offered by the TAR administration. Most of them were in the security department. So they have reduced the number of jobs by about 10,000 per year. Chen Quango used to have a whole lot. Many of them were deployed for electronic transcription of all the reports, etc., that they picked up. So there are pluses and minuses, but what we are seeing is a very strict grip, not only on China, but certainly on the peripheries and on Tibet. And I don't expect that to ease. I expect, in fact, this tough posture to continue because China is playing a much bigger game. It is not so much that they are directing everything against us. We happen to be in the way of China's ambitions. So that is what I can share with you, and I'm open to more questions. I'm sorry for exceeding the time, but thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranade, for your illuminating talk on the seismic shift which has taken place in China since Xi Jinping took power. And before I open to the floor, if I could take the privilege of being the moderator and ask you the first question. During the 19th party, well, not during the 19th Party Congress, but during the National People's Congress, Xi Jinping, when he gave the concluding remarks, he said something that you will face the punishment of history to those separatists, so they could be the Taiwanese or Tibetans or Uyghurs or any of those ethnic minority community. And one thing that we have observed during the National People's Congress is, as I think you have touched upon it briefly, it's the structural changes that is taking place within the party state. And for Tibetans and for someone who's researching on Tibet, what is really interesting and very important is to see that there is structural changes which are taking place within the United Front Work Department. So they have brought under the umbrella the SARA and then State Ethnic Affairs Commission too. So if you can give me your take on how the structural changes are going to impact the minority policy in China and on Tibet in particular.
The revamping of the United Front is still a work in progress. But few things which we can see. In September 2016, Xi Jinping took over as head of the Central Small Leading Group on the United Front. And the Central Small Leading Group is the most powerful body that manages the affairs of whichever outfit it is. After he took over, within months, we noticed 2 things. One, the United Front began expanding. So its size has grown, its budget has doubled. They've added 1 bureau, the 9th Bureau, particularly for monitoring students abroad and they're wanting to expand it to monitor Chinese citizens who are abroad. But as far as ethnic affairs is concerned, I think what we are seeing is a greater activation, at least little bit that I've seen, is a greater activation of the Buddhist associations inside China as passing directives to their branch offices on regulating the activities of Tibetan Buddhists. As I said, monks seem to be the target, monks and nuns. The other thing is, which I'm not very clear about, is whether the United Front Ministry or the department will start exercising more direct authority. I'm not sure. I think the feeling I get is it will still be left mainly to the provincial, to the party secretaries and to the autonomous regions. Here in the United Front, they may step up their dealing elsewhere. But since you raised the question, let me say that with reference to India, you are all aware, I'm sure, of what is happening in Australia, etc. But with reference to India, what I have seen is stepped up activities by the Chinese embassy in India. They have started reaching out in a more, shall I say, aggressive fashion to journalists, to students, to opinion makers, to intellectuals, to politicians, to try and win them over. Now, whether that was independent of Doklam or whether that was part of Doklam, I'm not sure. But it is happening in a very aggressive way. And here, they are targeting, or they seem to be targeting, Tibetan students and Tibetan youth. There are particular inquiries being made about the Tibetans in the south. Tibetans studying probably in, I suppose, in Madras. Sorry, you're from Madras? Well, Tibetans who are studying in the south or Tibetans who are residing in the south. Why this particular interest in the south, I don't know. But there seems to be. So does it mean, and I'm just throwing out a question, I'm not making any suggestion, I don't know. Does it mean they feel that they've got Dharamsala covered? Or does it mean that they find the people there easier to penetrate? Or is it that they have made no effort in the south so far and they want to target that? I don't know. But there is definite movement in that direction. The other thing is, what they're doing in Nepal, it's not directly relevant here, but they have, apart from giving old age pensions, etc., to people in the villages in northern Nepal, which borders Tibet, they've also talked about giving rations, etc., to the people living in those areas, obviously to win them over. They've given them special trade permits, allowing them to go 30 kilometers deep inside Tibet without any special passes and to trade whatever they want. So they're doing it in an all-round way of doing this. I expect to see in a short time, maybe even special programs being beamed out, like they're doing with CCTV, etc. But so far as I know, this is what the United Front is doing. Whether they are actually taking to themselves direct action for intervention, I'm not yet sure.
Thank you. On that note, I'll take questions. Well, Mr. Ranade will take questions. So 2 questions at a time, please.
Sir, thank you for your very interesting talk. But I'll try to come down to more simpler things. And so hearing all this, and over all these years, I wonder if despite the Xi Jinping's rising to this power and his strength and everything, and his state power and so forth, but I wonder if the Chinese people, and more specifically the Han Chinese, because the other 55 or so we know pretty well. So, given that they are properly educated and well informed, everything, so how do they see to Xi Jinping and his authoritarian setup for this big, great country?
Actually, I'm very glad you asked that question. I think firstly, it's a very incisive question. Secondly, in the Chinese tradition, let me self-criticize that I should have, in fact, touched on it. I was thinking of, it just slipped my mind. It's a very important question because the manner in which Xi Jinping has consolidated power and promoted himself has been very unusual. 30 years they have not seen it. The 2 generations have grown in that period. And I think the key was the manner in which the term limit for the President of China was dispensed. There is a two-term, that means 10-year limit on holding the office of the President of China. And that term limit was removed. By itself, it's not very significant because the post of President has no powers. But symbolically, it is of great importance because it indicates that he can now continue as long as he wants, holding all three positions. Secondly, the symbolism in this is again that the convention that a cadre who is 67 years old can be promoted into the Politburo or Politburo Standing Committee, he can choose to ignore. Because the convention was 67-year-old cadre can go up, 68-year-old cadre is out. But he can choose to ignore it now. This has caused, obviously, resentment. And we are seeing signs of this resentment being publicly expressed. In a country where I just mentioned how tight the controls are, which he has imposed, we have seen 2-3 instances. One was a very senior former editor-in-chief of the Chungko Chingnian Pao, which is the Communist Youth League, Delhi, a Communist Party member. He wrote an open letter, which he posted on WeChat, to all the deputies elected from Beijing, 50 delegates, elected from Beijing to the National People's Congress, saying, please oppose this. This is not what we want. We don't want the return of Mao Zedong type of thing. That is one. Second was there was a lady, 90 years old, who said, I'm old now, it doesn't matter, but this has to be opposed, and I'm saying it very openly, etc., etc. She also made the thing. There were the Chinese dissidents who are based abroad. They started a campaign saying, Xi Jinping is not our president. And there were cartoons of Xi Jinping with Winnie the Pooh, and there was a pot of honey, which was sticky. And they said, he's holding on to it, the sticky hands, you don't want to leave pot that you have. But those are dissidents abroad. So you can say, well, those are people who are not going to be affected. But the same posters and the same cartoons appeared in Shanxi University. And people are waiting to see what will happen. The head of Shanxi University has been asked to conduct an inquiry. And finally, the resolution itself of lifting of term limits should have been signed, concluded by the second plenum of the Chinese Communist Party. They had one plenum, they had a second. It was only at the third that it was announced. But the date of the notification was of the second. So they say that obviously there were differences within the party on that particular proposal. But interestingly, the editor-in-chief of Xinhua, which is, as you know, the most authoritative news agency, official news agency of China and a voice of the party, they issued that notification saying that this notification has been done, that this notification is issued and the term limit is being lifted in a news dispatch in English first, 3 or 4 hours before the Chinese one. And he has been removed from his job and he is under investigation for violation of party discipline. So there are, as I said, signs of resentment and possibly signs of opposition. How deep they are, I do not know. But I would suggest that in a society that is being so tightly controlled by this present president, for even these signs to come means that there is opposition. The fact that he has thrown out 14,000 PLA officers, so you multiply one person out of a job into at least 5 to 6 of his immediate family who are affected. There are large number who are out, large number in the higher echelons of Chinese society who are disaffected or who are disgruntled. So there is potential for, I think, some kind of turbulence. Finally, the information is not 100% sure, I'm not sure, but I got it from, shall I say, sources who are usually reliable, who said that in November last year, there was an attempt on Xi Jinping as a car bomb explosion. So if that is true, then there are definite signs of opposition.
Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for your insightful talk, sir. I have two questions actually. One is it refers to what we have said regarding Tibet, the situation in Tibet. So you said that the power had expedited the Chinese constituents in Tibet. That's around 40 tons. So that's the maximum they have spent compared to other areas in Tibet. So what do you think, how they will sustain it for another, maybe say, 10 or 20 years or so? Or will they able to sustain it? Or it will be like a kind of a cultural revolution and they do it for 10 years and then there will be some kind of relaxation. So that's my first question. And the second question is with regard to this local issue. And I believe that the current state is, the current situation is that the state is still there. And do you think any solution to this issue from both sides? And how long it will take? Thank you, sir.
I think due to old age, my hearing is not very good. But your first question I didn't hear very clearly. Were you saying how long can the Chinese sustain the present controls on Tibet? Okay, so then my hearing is all right. But I think they can sustain it. You know, there are two things here. One is the Chinese state itself, whether they are willing to make any compromise or not. And I think there are two questions before them. The first, which they seem to be very serious about, is that they do not want a situation of two Dalai Lamas, and I'm quoting them. They don't want a situation, as they say, quote, of two Dalai Lamas like there is of two Panchen Lamas. In other words, they say that if there are two Dalai Lamas, then the loyalties of the Tibetans will be divided. In other words, the Tibetans, the ones inside Tibet, as including the ones outside, will not accept the person whom the Chinese pick up as the Dalai Lama. That is their apprehension. So they don't want that situation to arise, and they're working towards that. But they're also preparing for it by trying to, when I said they're focusing on the monks and nuns, they did call them the so-called troublemakers in Tibet. By focusing on them, what they're trying to do is win them over. So they have offered them salaries, monthly salaries. They've offered them ranks equivalent to the provincial administration. They've offered them pensions. In other words, they're trying to buy out the monks and nuns. It's a difficult job, I think, because normally they're very difficult to buy out, from what I can see, what history shows. But they're trying. If they're able to mold the monks, they're then hoping that they'll be able to control Tibetan society more easily. So that is the effort that they're making, because the monks, as you know, are very influential among the local population. So they're trying to win them over. The third thing is that the Han Chinese, the question I think you should be asking yourself, instead of how long can the state sustain it, as long as the state is there, it will be able to sustain controls over Tibet. It is when the state decides that some accommodation is necessary that we will start seeing a change in policy. Because any state has a tremendous capacity to hold on to pieces of territory. It has its own cry of nationalism, which the others will go for. And when, I'll tell you, in 1991, during Tiananmen, I was in Beijing at that time, 89-90. I used to be in the square every day, in Tiananmen Square every day, every night really. I knew a lot of the people there, the young demonstrators, all your Chailings and Udangs, etc. And I asked them, I said, when you grab power, I mean, that was the way I put it, will you allow Tibet to be free? And they said, what is the question of freedom? It's part of China. That was their answer. So I said, then there's a lot of trouble in Tibet. I said, they're restive. Will you grant them more autonomy? They said, yes, we can discuss that. I'm mentioning that not to put them down, but to tell you that even a Han Chinese who's demonstrating against his government, in his mind, Tibet is a part of China. He's willing to work out some kind of arrangement, but he's not willing to go beyond a point. So the capacity of the state will be dependent on all these people extending their support. And I see that going on for a while. So what basically has to happen is either the state has to weaken or the resistance has to reach a level where the state feels it is better to compromise and maybe give more autonomy and authority to the region. So I hope that answers your question. The second was, you asked about Doklam, and you said whether the tensions still exist. As I said, yes, they do. And there are serious tensions. The troops are still deployed there. And frankly, things can happen at any time. Both sides know it. Both sides are preparing for it. So is that your question? Was that your point? To Doklam, yeah. I think there can be a solution if the Chinese decide that they don't want to change the status quo unilaterally. You know, 2012, there was an agreement that was signed between China, Bhutan and India, saying that the Chinese will not undertake road building activity, which means constructing the road to Gemochen, which is a small town there, southern point, 30 kilometers south of Batangla. And the reason is that we consider Batangla as the watershed and the tri-junction. The Chinese have not accepted that. They consider Gemochen as the tri-junction and the watershed. The reason is very simple. From the Chinese point of view, they're saying they treat Gemochen as the tri-junction because they would like to draw the boundary from Gemochen eastwards. If you do that, then Arunachal comes within Chinese territory. If you treat Batangla as the tri-junction and draw the border eastwards, which is what we want, and we are saying they followed McMahon line everywhere except there, then Arunachal is part of us. No one says it explicitly, but that's it. And that is the reason why they did it. And the reason why I said the Chinese probably didn't expect us to stop them was they thought that they can bully their way through, and this is what happened. So I don't think a solution is possible unless the Chinese do one of two things. One, which they're trying, which is trying to get the Bhutanese on their side and get the Bhutanese to ask us to quit. Whether we quit or not at that point is a different matter, but our relationship with Bhutan is pretty strong. And the second is if they enter into some dialogue with us, where they come to some kind of a compromise or some kind of a solution. And I don't see the Chinese today, under Xi Jinping, who has been fueling them with nationalism and ideology, I don't see him giving ground on any of these issues. Don't forget, since 2012, he has been pumping the people with nationalism, and in order to shore up his own position and the monopoly of the Chinese Communist Party on state power. So if he makes a concession to India on territory or anything like that, it will be seen as a sign of weakness within China, and I don't see that happening. So I think Doklam will have to live for a while with this tension till both sides agree on some kind of a modus vivendi. But right now, I think it seems a bit difficult.
Well, on that note, I will relieve myself of the duty as the moderator of this session, and I would like to request Kung Sambela to give the concluding remarks.
No concluding remarks. You did very well. Mr. Ranade, some books for you.
Oh. Lot of reading.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Deeply appreciate. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed your talk. We learned a lot, and we hope you'll come back with the Ramsala again and again. You and your research assistants. Thank you so much.
Thank you.